Ramana Maharshi puts his whole teaching into these 6 verses of Atma Vidya. It starts low, very easy is self-knowledge. I'm Richard Clarke. Listen to these verses and my comments on them. This week I continue with Atma Vidya, the 4th of 5 verses. Atma Vidya is one of several books written by Ramana Maharshi that were initiated by Muruganar. Thank you, Muruganar. Now for the 4th verse. These are Ramana's words. What is the use of knowing everything except the self? What else is there to know for anyone when the self itself is known? On realizing in oneself the self, which is the only self-effulgent one in myriad of selves, the light of the self will clearly shine within. This is indeed the true display of grace, the ego's death, and the unfolding of bliss supreme. Ramana starts this verse with, what is the use of knowing everything except the self? The self is always. Everything else comes and goes. Knowledge of the self is knowledge that is permanent. It never changes. Knowledge of all else is transient, temporary. Ramana says that what is real is what is always. The transient is no more real than last night's dream. Knowing the self is knowing what is always. Knowing everything else is like knowing the scales on the snake that was then recognized as the rope. Where are the scales now that you know it is a rope? What use is it to know more about what never existed to begin with? Next, Ramana says, what else is there to know when the self itself is known? Everything, every person, object, world, idea of a higher power, all of these exist in your awareness, in the consciousness that is the self. The self is all. There are no separate objects or people. The self is all. Ideas of separate things are just ideas, no more than phantoms, impermanent, changing. Their only existence is as the self. Ideas of difference are just ideas in the one reality with no this and that. Differences are imaginary. Then Ramana says, on realizing in oneself the self, which is the only self-effulgent one in myriad of selves, the light of the self will clearly shine within. Everything in the world, including the idea of self that is the ego I, including the world, is only known by the light of the awareness that is the self. Everything is known by the self. What lights up the self? What knows the self? Only the self can know the self.
The self is the only knower. All that is known by this knower. This knower is self-effulgent, lit by its own light. I use the inquiry, who knows this, as another angle of vision for inquiry. Objects are known by the mind. Who knows the mind? Thoughts and feelings are known by the mind. Who knows the mind? Many things are known, but there's only one knower. Look for yourself and verify this. Can you find more than one knower? Finally, Ramana says, this is indeed the true display of grace, the ego's death, and the unfolding of the bliss supreme. Where does the knowledge of the self come from? It is certainly not the mind. The mind cannot know the self, so there is nothing the mind, the ego I, can do to know the self. The most the mind can do is to step out of the way. Yet we can know the self. We do know the self always, all the time, just as we know our existence all the time. But we usually don't notice. Somehow, Ramana says, by grace, we are able to see and know what we are, what we have always been, the self. Knowing this, the false ego has no place to stand and dissolves. It dies. This disappearance of what never really existed to begin with brings the deepest happiness and bliss. You know that you are the bliss.
These videos help bring Ramana Maharshi's teachings into your direct experience. Subscribe now to help you deepen your understanding and practice to know the self. Just click the subscribe button.